the anthropology of disaster, which means that you have some hazard, a natural hazard, that hits an unprepared society. So a disaster, defined anthropologically, is not simply the natural, what we often call a natural disaster. There is also the component that you have to have human beings around and they have to be unprepared for this in some way. It leaves you looking like this. This was Yungay, Peru in 1970. Suffered a devastating earthquake. 70,000 people dead across the region. So in this case, an earthquake met a very unprepared society. So, a couple concepts to think about when we talk about the anthropology of disaster is first vulnerability. So, societies are differentially vulnerable, both between different societies and within certain societies. We can also often see this if we look at maps, for example. Let's say an earthquake hits an area. In some cases, certain neighborhoods will be completely devastated and others will be okay. Now, what accounts for that? It could be the same magnitude of earthquake. It's not necessarily that there was a different earthquake. Obviously, if you're further from the epicenter or whatever, it's going to affect you differentially. But often it's because the people in these areas had poor building construction. They didn't have the right building materials. They were unprepared for earthquake zone activity. And the same with things like flooding, fires. Obviously, these things are in part natural hazards, but they affect people differently based on where they live, what their houses are made of, what kinds of things that they've been exposed to previously, what their income levels are. Often these things hit harder in poor or marginalized communities than they do in wealthier areas. On the flip side of that is resilience, which means the capacity to rebuild and reshape your lives after a disaster. In some ways, to an extent, some of the same communities that are the most vulnerable, because they are poor and marginalized, are also in some ways can be more resilient, and that they have often depended on connections among people. They are in some ways used to a greater level of hazard. Sometimes that can lead to greater resiliency, a capacity to band together and to rebuild. Not all the time. Sometimes resilience disappears under certain disaster conditions, but it is the flip side of vulnerability, and it's something that we should look to build in, not only pre-existing to the natural hazards, but also draw upon in order to survive or weather them. For the most part, the archaeological record shows us that many societies built sustainable systems of agriculture or hunting and gathering. And people in some ways were I don't want to say they were in balance with their environment, but they were doing okay up to about 500 years ago. Different subsistence systems had developed around the world, and there were local instances in which people had obviously experienced disasters. And some of them might have been in part based upon what the people themselves were doing. So your textbook talks about path dependency, and they give us the example of the Hohokam in what is now southern Arizona. This is a case in which people built irrigation systems, very sophisticated water management systems. They were doing pretty well for a while, but the system was not very flexible. And as you may know, the Southwest often experiences long periods of drought. And during those periods, this is very damaging to their society. The idea of path dependency is that you get hooked on a particular technology or a particular crop, We talked about famines that result from monocropping, where you are too dependent on potatoes or corn, for example, or even wheat. And once something hits that path that you're dependent on, your society is going to be in trouble. And the same thing seems to have occurred here with the irrigation systems during the drought. Before Europeans ever came to the Americas, this was a place where people rose and our civilization got to high levels and then declined in part because of this of what we might call path dependency and disasters. So, your textbook says that disaster anthropology was born in around the 1970s and then has then been extended into different areas like archaeology, studying the process that precedes, unfolds during, and follows a hazard that creates significant human harms. Going back to the beginning, anthropology is the study of human beings. So we are interested in how these natural hazards create human harms, often in vulnerable populations, and to what degree people can adapt or are they resilient to those changes. This is a relatively recent field, rising in the 1970s, about 50 years ago. But in some ways, I would contend that anthropology has always been disaster anthropology because of a disaster for many peoples from which anthropology itself was born. This quote is an interesting summary of what anthropology has been as a discipline. Anthropology emerged less as a science of human nature than as the study of the damage done by one part of mankind to another, and thereby to all of humanity. Now, what in the world is this person talking about? I put up a picture here of Arizona today, where they also have irrigation canals. And they are also often almost at war with each other over that water supply. Because as we know, this area often goes into droughts. And maybe the indigenous people of that society were not completely wrong in changing it up so that they would not rely on intensive irrigation in order to live in this area. What we're now finding is that parts of the Southwest, which we took over the irrigation canals and ramped them up on an industrial scale, may be in a certain way vulnerable to the same hazards which might cause more widespread disasters if some of the water supplies and the food supplies fail. Fortunately, we're still okay, hopefully, but that's what has often gone on is people have thought that their way of doing things was more important than the way the people were doing things in those areas. But it turns out those people knew what was going on. Now, the damage done by one part of mankind to another. Anthropology began in European and North American societies who were studying other people. And those other people had already been influenced. People had gone from one part of the world to another part of the world, had taken over the land and resources of that area, and then had begun to extract things from that area and then sell it on global markets. And so this is what your textbook defines as extractivism, when you go into an area and take things out of that area and transform it so that you can sell it for a profit. This extractivism, the modern form of extractivism, was first felt by people who were indigenous to the Americas, who we might call Native Americans if we think about the whole continent of North and South America and the Caribbean. But indigenous peoples who are often displaced from their lands and subject to what we can only call genocide, because they were deliberately excluded from this, put into a labor process, and suffered enormous population declines during this time. The first goal, as you might think about from the Spaniards and what Christopher Columbus was after, was gold and silver. There was not a ton of gold available, although the Spaniards took as much as they could from the Incas and other places and melted it down. Later on, they would discover silver mines, especially in what is now Bolivia and what is now Mexico. There was a mine in Bolivia in the city of Potosi, which supplied almost half the world's silver. Completely transformed the global economy because you now had a new form of currency. You could inject it into those ancient trade routes that we talked about. This was an enormous undertaking. The city of Potosi, Bolivia, was at its time larger than London and Paris. It was a huge hub way up in the Andes Mountains. Nobody's even heard of it now. Nobody knows where it is or has ever been there, but it still continues to supply silver, but at a much smaller scale. It supplied at the time over half the world's silver over these centuries. There are still people there mining the silver, but not at the same quantities. They are still taking silver out of this mountain in Potosi, Bolivia. Most of it is in the silver that we now have. It's been put into the world economy. But yes, this is where again, over half of the world's silver came during this time, and it really was very important for the Spanish Empire and everybody else who were trying to get their hands on the silver. Again, this was a huge city. It was a bigger city at its time than London and Paris. It had people from all over the world there, including enslaved people. Later on in the Americas, that currency and that mining would pave the way, or would again make possible a new phase of plantation agriculture, mostly around sugarcane, which would again transform the diets of most people in the world. Something like 10 to 12 million Africans were enslaved and dragged from their homes in order to work on, for the most part, on plantations in the Americas. In the United States, we usually think of this as a cotton thing, and it's true, that's important. But for the most part, this was a sugar thing. What is now the contemporary United States, in comparison to islands like Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and a number of other quite small Caribbean islands, imported an enormous number of enslaved Africans. What is now Brazil, under the Portuguese, was the largest. Something like 4 million Africans were taken from their homes and put to work on the sugar plantations in Brazil. This was one of the deadliest jobs you could do. It was a really difficult job, and the average lifespan of someone put on this was about 7 years. Now, people live longer, reproduced, but in terms of the story of the Americas and the product that moved the most people around in human history, it was sugar. So, what resulted is that the societies in the Americas became structured by this structural racism, in which some people were grouped at the top, the people who were overseeing the plantations, the people who owned the plantations, the people who owned the mines, the people who owned these commodities, and the people who were forced to labor for them, were often taken from elsewhere or displaced from their own societies in order to work in these places. Silver, sugar, gold, all of these resources from the Americas, timber, furs, would fuel the Industrial Revolution, which came much later. And laborers in the factories of the Industrial Revolution were able to do as much work as they could because they were fueled by the now cheap sugar calories that were being brought in and processed from the Americas. And if you look at the plantation system and the organization of labor there, it is much more like a factory than it is like traditional agriculture. That is to say, people are part of the processing of sugar is very factory-like. It requires a lot of industrial equipment. Same with the mining. In Potosi, there was a rather industrial component to this long before what we know of as the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, the Industrial Revolution has given us many nice things. Maybe not distributed equally across all populations, but hey, we like our stuff. But many of the areas which fueled the Industrial Revolution have now been forgotten and have been left as disaster areas. The city of Potosi now is shrinking in population, and yes, they gave us a lot of silver, but we left them with a lot of environmental pollution, poisoned water. Same thing with a lot of the plantations in the Americas, very hard on the soil, very draining of it. Many of these places are now considered some of the poorest in the world. Haiti was once the colony of France. Saint-Domingue was one of the richest places in the world, was considered the crown jewel of French colonialism. Napoleon was going to base part of his empire in the Americas on his control over Haiti. There was a slave rebellion, an uprising, which overthrew the French, the Haitian Revolution, because Napoleon had lost his richest and wealthiest island in the Americas. He sent over another army to re-enslave the Haitians, but they drove that army into the sea. He gave up on his imperial ambitions in the Americas. Thomas Jefferson was surprised that Napoleon was offering to sell him so much land for so cheap because of the Louisiana Purchase. Well, why did he do that? He did that because he had lost the best stuff, the stuff that was valuable to him, which was Haiti. So we usually don't learn and thank the Haitians for their contribution to American history, but without them, it is quite doubtful that Jefferson would have been able to buy Louisiana, that whole big land purchase, for as little money as he did. Napoleon was like, screw this, I'm going to try and dominate Europe instead. If he had been able to maintain the sugar plantations of Haiti at their current levels, it would have been very valuable to him. The whole American thing, the land that the French had, would have been worth something. But once he lost Haiti, it was not as valuable for him to keep the rest of it. That big tract of land that we know of as the Louisiana Purchase was not seen as that important. Because the main generators of wealth during this time were sugar plantations. And honestly, at that time, at the time of the Civil War, the single largest amount of wealth, if measured in monetary terms, was in enslaved African persons in the United States. The biggest chunk of wealth. So we don't often learn this story because we learn about other things like the people in some cotton gin or something, or people in Europe and their factories. Those are important, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the story of what happened in the world has been buried because we forget about these places that fueled our rise in the economy, in the same way that we forget about the stuff that goes into our cell phones and our computers and our cars until somebody blockades the Strait of Hormuz, and then everything gets crazy. So when anthropology was founded, and again, it was founded in this situation in which some people had been structured to be in a different position than others. When anthropology was founded 100 years ago or so, there were a number of assumptions that were made. One of the assumptions was that the indigenous people had all gone away. They were a sad remnant of what they once were, and if they hadn't disappeared, they would soon. They were going away because the march of progress, or whatever you want to call it, was just going to wipe them out. And the accompanying assumption was that now that we had modernization and industrialization, everybody should do the same thing. We should all industrialize. This applied to many different societies. India, China, all over the place. Everybody said, hey, we need to industrialize using these efficient techniques that we're going to get from the Europeans. And that the things that other people were doing with their land or their water or their resources were dumb or not efficient. So if you were a hunter and gatherer, that was an inefficient thing, and you should go get a tractor and plow up that land and start putting some crops in there. In the last 20 years or so, maybe 50 years, there's been a number of surprises. One surprise. Hey, wait a second. Indigenous people are still here. There are still people who identify as Native American, and they would like to have some control over their lives and resources. A second surprise is that when we industrialize certain areas, it can come with its own disasters. We talked about one of those. Gary, Indiana, the site of the largest steel mill in the United States, the source of so much wealth, of so much American steel, so many airplanes, has now been left in a state of, hopefully not as bad as it once was, but it's been poisoned, environmentally speaking. And this has happened in many different places. Again, this was first happened, we could see it in the Americas with mining and plantations, but we can also see it in industrial areas. There's some places like that in New York State you might be familiar with, where they've been poisoned by the industrialization that has taken place. Some people have discovered that some of these things that people made fun of, ways of doing things like hunting and gathering or traditional agriculture or trying to grow crops without all the chemicals, might not be as stupid as we thought. Maybe some of these people were smart. And maybe in certain areas that is a more sustainable practice. The kinds of plants and animals that people were doing in the Amazon, for example, seem to have been sustainable for that Amazonian region. It turns out taking a tractor and plowing up rainforests so that you can put cows on it to make hamburgers may not be the most sustainable practice in a rainforest, as we are finding out. So, a few examples of this. One of them in your textbook is from the Mohawk Nation that spans the borders of the United States and Canada and pre-exists those national borders, where many plants factories were set up. Alcoa. Alcoa, yeah. All sorts of things that were very important for us. General Motors, Alcoa, Reynolds. These put certain things into the environment, building all the wonderful things that we have, in the process giving us PCBs, fluoride, and heavy metals, which then polluted the waterway and made it very difficult to eat the traditional fish and this wildlife and the soil upon which the indigenous Americans had depended. And so for a long time, you could not eat fish out of the St. Lawrence River because they were so contaminated. We cleaned it up a little bit so that you can say that you can eat like one fish a month or so. But honestly, it's been a very difficult thing, and this has resulted in soil issues, all kinds of problems. Again, because of the industrial stuff that we like so much and where these things were located. Your textbook mentions Hyde Park, Georgia, which is a neighborhood, but this happens a lot of times. This is in Atlanta. predominantly black neighborhood, but as you can see, it gets surrounded by a power substation, industrial areas, a scrap metal yard, and a landfill. And then people are trying to live in this area and raise kids. It becomes difficult when your environment is vulnerable to this much pollution. Oh, plus a couple railroads. There are current debates now because people are trying to locate those data centers similarly, which are hugely draw on power, water, and other resources. So we all love our AI. I know I do, but every time we use it, we're drawing power from somewhere. This is perhaps the newest environmental issue of our time is how much power it will take to use our devices. This is a neighborhood in Atlanta, Hyde Park. Yeah. Now, again, some of this is better than it was before. Don't get me wrong, people have become aware of this. Textbook also talks about the Marshall Islands, where we decided that would be a good place to conduct nuclear tests. Blew up the island. I guess it was nice of us to move the people off their home before you blow it up. We talked about before, some of these islands were depopulated in order to harvest the nitrates, the fertilizer stuff. I don't want to get us all depressed. We will hopefully learn about some changes or some modifications that people have been making to try and not do this as much anymore. But we should recognize the history in which our modern world has been built upon displacing and disastering people, and many of the great things that we have and the wonderful things still to this day that we rely upon are built by the labor of people in other places. Anthropology, again, was born during the time when we are studying these processes and these people in other places. This would be an island that anthropologists would go to study their traditional culture. But it would be stupid to be an anthropologist and not realize that many of these people were moved around and in some ways put into very bad conditions before the anthropologist ever got there. So if you're going to study the culture of someone, it is also important to understand what has happened to them and why they may not even be on the island where they were born, if you had to blow it up for the nuclear bombs. Now, did that keep the peace for a while? Maybe, but at the substantial human cost in other ways. These people never were able to move back. It's still uninhabitable in that area. Again, anthropology usually tries to understand people's lives and often the people who have been left out, or how to say, were the people who made all this good stuff possible, but then got forgotten and ignored. Anthropology as a discipline says that we shouldn't just study the powerful, we should study the people who contributed to the building of the modern world. We're thinking about marriage customs and health issues, and gender, and all the things that we love to study in anthropology. We have to remember this context as well.